So we're upping the level of design again, looking at adding image textures to our models. So we're moving from the low poly style to a more realistic style, kind of within the realms of older games that use these techniques to good effect. And we're going to work on the plane model you can see behind me here. So we'll be once again doing some modeling, but this time our focus will be on using photographic images as textures on the side of the plane and buildings. We'll start the section with some very simple exercises to learn the skills, so making some very simple houses and barrels, then move on to making the plane with the textures, and to finish we'll introduce you to some very basic animation techniques to get you ready for the following section, which is all about animation. So let's get started. In this lecture we'll be learning about the basics of UV mapping and making a really simple building. So I'm in the general startup file and I've got my cube in the center and I'm going to select that. Now any of the basic primitives, so if I press Shift A to add and mesh, each of these apart from the circle comes with a UV map. We can find that if I come down to the bottom here under Object Data Properties, UV Maps, you can see that here. To take a look at that map we need to go to the UV Editing workspace up the top here. And you can see that UV map just there. A UV map is all the faces of my object put into 2D. So I can now place a 2D image on my 3D object, and Blender knows how then to map it out onto that 3D object. The UV editing workspace puts our object into edit mode. And if I deselect all with Alt A, my UV map disappears, and select all with A, it comes back again. And I can zoom in with my wheel to see my UV map a bit easier. So we've got the 3D viewport over the right hand side and we've got the UV editor on the left. If I just show you that up here, that's the UV editor, not the image editor. They look very similar, but they have slight differences. Now in order to see the effects of this UV map, I need to put an image onto my object. Now I can create an image within the UV editor, but it can be a little bit confusing as to what's happening if I don't also show you the shader editor. So I'm going to come to the top corner here, click and drag a new window out and change this to the shader editor so you can see what's happening. I don't need my tool options over here, so I'll press N to get rid of that panel and zoom in so you can see it's got a principled BSDF on my default cube over here. And I'll scroll across the top and change it to material preview mode. So we can see it turns white as my material is white over here. So I'll need to bring in an image texture node just here and plug it into my base color. So Shift A to add texture and image texture, bring that into the front there, but I'm not hooking it up just yet. So take a quick moment to catch up with me, select your cube, go across to the UV editing workspace, open a new shader window and bring in an image texture node. Okay, so you'll notice within the UV editor that I've got a new option here and an open option, just as I have in the image texture node. So if I press new in here, to create a new image, we can create images within Blender. I'll call it test. The pixel resolution is roughly 1000 pixels squared. So that's how many pixels are on the image. And that would be classed as a 1K image. You can obviously change these, but roughly 1000 pixels is just fine for us. I'll talk a little bit more about pixels later. The generator type, if I click on that, we can have a blank texture or I can change it to something like a color grid and press OK. And that looks like this. It's a grid with colors and letters to help us see where different faces are on our 2D image. So take a quick moment to catch up with me and bring in a new texture. Now notice it's only in my UV editor. It's not within my shader editor, so we're not able to see it on my object. Also, my image texture node is still the same. I need to bring this test image into my image texture node and then hook it up in order to see the texture on my object. So I can click on the down arrow to find all the textures within Blender at the moment, and we've got this one we created here. So I'll click on test, hook it up, and it automatically uses the UVs of the cube in order to map it onto our cube, which we can see here. So take a moment to catch up with me and create a new color grid and hook the texture up to our base color. I'll just move the shader editor up slightly so I can zoom in on my UVs just here. And hopefully you can see my UVs here on top of the image, and that corresponds to where the UVs are on my 3D object. I'll explain a little bit further. Currently, if I move across my panel at the top and go to face mode, you can see the different faces as I select them in the UV editor. And when I select all, you can hopefully just about see all the faces there. So these are the different faces of the box, and you can see it's being kind of flattened out like this. I can also, if I move across the top panel in the UV editor, I can change from vertices. So currently I can select vertices within here, edges and faces. So that's F4 and F5. Let's see if we can find that on our object. That's around to the side here. So if I press G to grab now in the UV editor, you can see I can now move that face and affect which numbers on my grid are being shown. It's also stretching the textures around as well. So those faces that it is attached to are being stretched. I right click to cancel that, come around to the side so you can see that more clearly. G to grab, and you can see those other faces being stretched as the edges joining to them are being moved. So this top face, for example, which is just here, if I go to the edge and choose the very edge here, press G to grab in the X-axis and move that inwards, you can see me stretching the texture. I can make it cover more or cover less, but I'll right click to cancel that. Incidentally, we can also scale with S and R to rotate, and that changes it accordingly. So pause the video here and just experiment with that, selecting some edges and vertices and moving them, and see how that affects the image on your cube. Once you've done that, make sure you undo any movement and bring it back to where I am here. Now for this next bit, I want to show you what it looks like with an actual image on our cube, and we're going to make a house. That means you might want to download a texture. The texture site I often use is textures.com. You do need to create an account, and you get 15 free credits each day, and each texture costs a certain amount of credits. It's got a really extensive library of textures. If I go to Browse Library, and we're going to choose Buildings, so I'll choose on Buildings, and we can see that it's got lots of folders of lots of different types of buildings. So I'll choose Old Apartments, for example. What we're looking for is something nice and flat like this, so we can put our faces onto different areas and map out an apartment building, much like this one here. So I'll choose this one by left clicking on that. Here are the download options. If you want to search for this image, it's Buildings House Old 0338, but you can choose any building you find as long as it's nice and flat like this one here. And I would encourage you to choose your own. I'll go for the bigger resolution with 2 credits, as we'll get a sharper image. So I'll click on that to download. And now I'm back into Blender. I can go across to my shader editor and open up an image. I have a whole folder full of textures. And if I type in buildings in the search bar, we can see this building that I downloaded here. Do make sure the name appears down the bottom here. So I'll click it again, make sure that name appears and open image. And we can see that image stretched across my object. Now you may see the image appear in the bottom here, as this is now the main image on this object. Sometimes you need to go into object mode and back into edit mode to see it, but that isn't working either. So I'm going to have to actually click on my down arrow here and choose that textures.com texture here, and there's my building. So it doesn't always match up with the texture here. If I had chosen a different object and come back to this one, it probably would. But just be aware that you may have to find your texture in the dropdown. And this dropdown gives a list of all the textures loaded into Blender. Now, if I press Control Spacebar to make this window full screen, you can see the outline of my box once again, and it's stretched slightly to correspond to the aspect ratio of my image. The aspect ratio is the difference between the height and the width. And this is quite a long, thin image, and therefore my faces have been stretched in accordance to that. So I'll press Control Spacebar and go back to our object, and you can kind of see how they've been stretched. If I choose this face here, you can see that it's stretched across there. It's also the wrong way round, so I'm going to have to rotate some of my faces as well. Now, one thing that's slightly confusing, if I select all and go to face mode and select this face in the UV editor and press G to grab, you can see that the faces around it that are joined to it are also being stretched. Once again, G to grab, you can see they're being stretched. However, if I select just this face, that makes only that face visible in the UV editor, and now press G to grab, it separates it. That can be a little bit confusing. So if I select any of these individual faces, select that face, make sure you're in face mode for that, and G to grab, I can now move them into different positions. But do make sure you've just got that face selected. So I'll choose this front face here. This can be the front of the house, so I'll have this door here. I'll rotate it 90 degrees, and it's difficult to see, but I think it's actually negative 90, and press enter, and then start scaling it in the X-axis. So S then X, and G to grab to move that into position. Let's see what that's looking like. That's kind of working as the front of our house. Although I don't want this top window in here, so let's scale it down just a touch more. I'm trying to keep it fairly square. S then Y. If I don't keep it square, you can see that it stretches my texture like this. So probably somewhere around here, then G then Y to bring it down. What is a tiny bit confusing is that this is X and Y, and I often think this is up and therefore Z, but no, it's just X and Y for a flat image. Okay, so pause the video here and catch up with me moving one of your faces to correspond with that part of the house on the image. Okay, so I've moved one into position. Let's come around to the side here, select this one, select the face again, R minus 90, and I'll move this into a different position. Let's say over here, scaling the X, so it's square, bring it down, and I'll scale it down a little bit more so the top windows aren't quite in, somewhere around here. And I can probably scale in the X just a touch. It does stretch it a little bit, but I think we're okay. So we can't see too much stretch there. For the top roof, if I select that, we don't really want any windows on there because that doesn't make sense. So let's scale it down and scale in the Y so it's square. And then I can move it to a position where it's just plaster like this. I'll zoom in a bit, scale it down just a touch more, and somewhere around there. Now obviously this is covering less pixels than our side images such as this one here. You can see that's covering a bigger area. So this one here, if I zoom in to this, is a little bit more pixelated and blurry, whereas these ones are a bit more sharp. So the higher the resolution, the sharper your images are going to be in here, and the smaller area you are covering with your UVs, the more pixelated it will be, because we're seeing less pixels. So I've got two sides done and the roof done. Your challenge then is to catch up with me and finish off the other sides of the cube by placing those corresponding faces into position. You can use any position on your image. It doesn't even matter if you overlap another one and choose exactly the same position as you've already used on another wall. So pause the video and have a go at that. So let's take this face for example. I'll select the face in the image editor, R minus 90 to rotate it round, scale it down, scale in the X to make it square. So somewhere around here, and I can just have this area around here. So I'll scale in the X and just have that one window this time on the side there. Looks a little bit strange because it's not lining up with this window. So I could press G to grab in the Y to make them a bit more aligned, and scale in the Y as well to just try and make them level, somewhere around there. Now notice that this is probably overlapping this image here, and as you can see as I select both those, or I can select them both together and you can see they clearly overlap. And like I said earlier, that's absolutely fine. So let's come around to the last one, select that face, R minus 90, G to grab, and I'll choose this top window up here. So I'll scale it down a bit, scale in the X, move to that top window and try and scale it so it fits roughly in line with the other ones. Not the best house, but it just about works. Okay, so hopefully you got an okay with that. Do make sure you've saved this scene because we'll be continuing with it next time. In this lecture, we'll be breaking down what are seams and what are UV islands, and we'll begin making a wooden barrel. First of all, let's understand what seams are. Let's think about a t-shirt. It starts off as one single piece of cloth, much like our 2D textures. The shapes are then cut out and stitched together to make a 3D t-shirt. And if you look at t-shirts, they have seams where they are joined together. This is exactly the same in a 3D program. We have to mark seams on our 3D objects in order to show Blender how we want our 2D textures to be positioned on those 3D objects. So with that in mind, here's where we got up to last time. And I'm still in the UV editing workspace and my object is still in edit mode. So I'm going to go back to object mode with tab. And just to quickly show you, if I zoom into my object slightly, and press S to scale in the Z, the textures will stretch with the objects like this. And if I make my object much taller and go back into edit mode and choose this face here, it's exactly the same size as it was previously and square. So changing the scale of the object will not affect your UVs, it will just stretch them. And that's something that's important to understand and you'll get used to as you go along. If you want a taller building, then you will need to come into the UV editor, select your faces and scale Y to make them fit the new scale. But I'll undo that and go back into object mode to its original size. There are in fact other ways of changing the UV maps so that they match the scale, but we'll talk more about these things later on. So let's talk a little bit more about how we can set up UV maps for different objects. If I add a cylinder, so Shift A to add, mesh, and then cylinder, I'm going to come down to the dialog box at the bottom here and change the vertex count to 16. So there's less vertices and therefore less UVs to have to move and adjust. And press enter, and I'll minimize this dialog box and just move this off to the side so we can see it. I'll scale it down as well. We can have a wooden barrel next to our building. I'll just move that into position. Now I've just gone to front view and noticed that my building is in the negative Y. So I'll select all and RZ180 so that it's all in the positive Y. Now when I go to front view, I can position these on the floor. That's in case you wanted to make a little scene in here. Okay, so back into our barrel shape here. I'll just scale, Shift Z, so it's a little bit thinner, something like this. Okay, so take a moment to catch up with me, add in a cylinder and change the vertices to 16, and you can place them on the grid floor if you like, next to one another. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so with my barrel selected, let's come across to the object data properties, look at the UV maps, and we can see there's a UV map there. So if I go into edit mode, we can see our UV map. Currently it's against my very stretched image, so the UV map is actually very stretched. I'm just going to come across my top panel here. Incidentally, I use the middle mouse button to do that, and close the texture down, and then zoom in and we can see our very nice UV map of a cylinder. I'll bring the panel back to the far left, and we've got our vertices, edges and faces. Now what I didn't mention before is that we've also got islands. If I click that, I can click on what are known as the islands. An island is a group of faces on your object that are joined together, but they're separate from the other faces or the other islands, as you can see there. So this object has 3 islands. I'll undo that scaling. Now the outside edges of the island are known as seams. So if I add a new material for this cylinder, and I'll just make my shader editor bigger so you can see it nice and easily, and zoom into my cylinder slightly. Now with the Node Wrangler installed, remember that's Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, type in Node, and make sure your Node Wrangler is ticked. I can click on the principled BSDF and press Ctrl-T to bring up these 3 nodes. So that's an image texture, a mapping node, and a texture coordinates. So you can see at the moment my cylinder has gone all black. That's because we haven't got an image texture in here. I'm going to click on the image texture, and again with the Node Wrangler I can press Shift S to switch this texture to a different texture. This is the same as deleting it and then adding a new one in, but Shift S is a little bit faster. So I'll choose a Musgrave texture because we can easily see the shapes on our object. So currently the default is using the UV mapping method, and you should be able to see the seams around the top here. So that's one island there. Let's click on that and press G to grab to move it around. Oh, that's the bottom one. I'll click the top one here. So G to grab and move that around. And you can clearly see those seams around the top. So that's where the textures hit each other and make a sharp line. The same if I select all the middle. So this is the faces going all the way around the object. G to grab, and again we can see the seam at the top, but we can also, hopefully you can see a seam coming down the side here. So if I press G to grab, you can see a sharp line where the seam joins. So this has been unwrapped much like a label around a tin of food. So I'll undo that movement. So pause the video here, add in the material for your cylinder, and bring in your 3 nodes by clicking on the principled BSDF and press Ctrl-T. Switch the image texture to a Musgrave texture, and just move the UV islands to see the effect that has. Make sure you undo any movement before you carry on though. Pause the video and have a go at that. Now just to remind you that these textures here are procedural, and when we use something like the generated texture coordinates, if I plug that in, you can see that we can't see any seams on our objects. So these corners here and this line down here don't seem to make any difference. So the generated can be very useful with procedural textures so that you don't get any seams. However, using UV texture coordinates is more common because you can transfer that between different programs, so go from Blender to a game engine such as Unity or Unreal, and you can use any texture that you find. In our case, we're going to use some wood for our barrel. Now, in order to see these seams, if I zoom out just a touch, select all my UVs and come up to UV, and if I go to the seam section and click on seams from island, you can suddenly see these orangey reddy lines going around the edges of my islands. So we can clearly see that seam down the middle of this big island here. And I'll just go around the object to show you that this is the only seam. So we've got this big kind of label around the middle there and the top and bottom, and you can see those seams marked out. So pause the video here, select all your UVs, and under the UV menu, use the tool Seams from Island to show your seams. Pause the video and have a go at that. Now what I want to show you is how you can create your own UV map and not just use the generated map that's created here. Because when we start creating more complex objects, we won't have a map to rely on and we'll have to create our own. So if I delete this map in the Object Data Properties under the UV Maps and use the minus button, that clears my UVs, and because Blender doesn't know where to put the image, it's made it all black. Now to create my own UVs, I can press U to unwrap and unwrap, and you can see those UVs being created there. But they look slightly different. And we've got an error message at the bottom here, which is object has non-uniform scale. So Blender has taken into account the scale of this object and created the UVs accordingly. If I go back into object mode now with tab, press Ctrl A to apply the scale, then back into edit mode, with everything selected, press U and unwrap, you can see that it's come out slightly differently. Now it's still not quite the same as the UVs we had before, but that's because we had rescaled this object with a different height to width. So the UVs represent that correctly. So pause the video, catch up with me, and delete the UV map that's currently on the object and create a new one. Do remember to apply your scale. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so hopefully you're understanding seams a little bit more. What I want you to do next is add the monkey object. Make sure you go back into object mode for that. Then go into edit mode and have a look at the UV islands. Then with all the UVs selected, go into the UV menu and mark seams from islands. Delete the current UV map and recreate it by pressing U to unwrap and then choosing unwrap. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so I'll need to go into object mode, zoom out just a touch, Shift A to add, mesh and then monkey. I'll just move that across to the side slightly and I'll scale it down so we can zoom in and have it next to our barrel just here. I'll go into edit mode and you can see the UVs mapped out here. So if I select all, I can come up to the UV menu and choose seams from islands. And there you can see those orange lines marking out the islands. And you can see a rather unusual UV map of how it's split it up and flattened it out. I can come across to my UV map now and delete that. Make sure all the faces are selected on my monkey, press U to unwrap and then unwrap, and we can see a very similar unwrap here. But interestingly, once again, it's not exactly the same as the original UV map for that monkey, but it does have the same islands. So with islands selected, you can see those different islands for the ears here, the eyes, and the rest of the face. So hopefully you got an okay with that and you're beginning to understand UV mapping. Don't panic if it's not all making sense yet. The more we create UVs and play with the UVs, the more you'll begin to understand them. So do make sure you've saved your work, ready for next time. In this lecture, we'll continue our understanding of UV mapping by marking our own seams and placing a barrel texture onto our barrel. So here's where we got up to last time, and I'm still in edit mode for the monkey head. I'm going to quickly show you what happens if we clear all the seams on this monkey and try and unwrap it. So if I select all with A, to clear the seams or completely get rid of the seams, I can either press Ctrl E to go to the edge menu, and there's clear seams there, or if I just bring this window out slightly, you can see the edge menu here, and there's clear seams just there. So with everything selected, that's gotten rid of all the seams on this monkey. Now if I press U to unwrap, again with everything selected and unwrap, you can see the unwrap here. Now it has actually got 3 islands, and I'm in island selection mode at the moment. This island here and here are actually the eyes. If I deselect all with Alt A and press L over the eye, so that's linked selected, so it will select internal separate objects, and press G to grab in the Y, you can see that the eyes are actually separate internal objects. The same for the other one. And if I select all, you can see it's trying to take the whole entire head and squash it down into this mess here. If I press Ctrl Spacebar over this window and zoom in, you can see this monkey head here, and you can kind of just about make out some features in here. That looks to be an eye socket maybe there, perhaps an ear here. It's very difficult to make out, but basically it's as if a large object has landed on the top of the shape and just squashed it and flattened it out like a pancake. That's what happens when you have no seams on your objects. So I'll press Ctrl Spacebar to come out of full screen mode, and I'll show you more about how you can create seams on your object in just a moment. But for now, we'll delete the monkey. So I'll come into object mode with tab and press delete. I'll select on my barrel here, press the period key to zoom in on that. I'll move the window in slightly so we've got a bit more space for our shader editor and UV image editor. I'll also press the T key to get rid of the side tool panel there. So that's the T key. And for this, I'm going to go into edit mode and I'm going to clear the seams on my barrel as well, because we're going to mark them in ourselves so I can show you that process. So select all, Ctrl E to go to the edge menu or the edge menu again up the top here, and clear seams. Okay, so pause the video here and make sure you've caught up with me. Delete the monkey, make sure you're in object mode when you do that, and then select our barrel, go into edit mode and clear the seams. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, now you can see if I bring out my UV image here that we've still got our island set up and it still looks like it's been unwrapped, yet we have no seams. So even though we have no seams, our old UV map is still working. And you can see that if I were to select an island and press G to grab, you can see the top moving about, and I'm moving about that face in the UV editor. So you can delete the seams and still have a UV map. However, I'm going to delete this UV map by clicking the minus button in the UV maps option. And again, it turns black because it doesn't know where to put our Musgrave image. I'll make sure all selected with A and press U to unwrap and unwrap. And it's unwrapped, but it's failed in some way. And you can see it's tried to unwrap this and it's unwrapped every single individual face separately so they all look the same because they're all covering the whole of this image, including the bottom and the top. So we therefore have to mark some seams. This is fairly straightforward. I can go to edge mode and Alt left click on the top edge loop here and press Ctrl E to go to the edge menu and mark seams. The same for the bottom. So Alt left click on that. I can actually also right click and mark seams. It's a slightly different menu, but it's got mark seams within there as well. So I can mark seams there. So I've separated the bottom and the top and the middle. So pause the video and catch up with me, marking the seams for the top face and the bottom face. Remember, you can either press Ctrl E or you can right click to get the mark seams option. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, now if I select all now and press U to unwrap and unwrap, I've got 3 circles. And you should have the same as me when you do the same. Now have a quick think as to why there are 3 circles instead of a flat middle section as we had before. Well, hopefully you've realized I need a seam down the middle for this middle section going all the way around to unwrap properly. Just like a label has a kind of seam going down one side and the 2 edges are stuck together on the can of food or whatever it may be, our barrel needs the same. So I can select this edge, right click, mark seams. Now when I select all and press U to unwrap and unwrap, we can see we've got this nice flat label-like island as well as the top and the bottom. So pause the video and catch up with me, making sure you've marked that extra seam down the side like I have. Okay, so now we need some sort of barrel texture. So I'm in textures.com and I've searched for barrel. If I scroll down a bit, I'll show you this one first. Now I have downloaded this and I will show you the results, but it isn't actually that great. If I choose the zoom button, you can see at the bottom along the metal strips, they're slightly darker than at the top. So when we put this on our barrel, we'll get a really obvious seam. I'll show you that in a moment within Blender. A better option is this one over here because it keeps consistency from the top to the bottom. So this is the main one that we'll be using. So make sure you've downloaded that. You can always just go for some simple wooden barrel like this. So maybe download that one, try that out too. Another one that I want you to try, if we close this down, is perhaps this plank one at the top here. If I select that, you can see that it's not actually based on a barrel, but it could possibly come up with a good looking barrel in the end. So I've downloaded this second one here. So we've got 3 options there that you can try. So pause the video here and make sure you downloaded those 3 options that I mentioned. You may even want to download the one that I suggested not to use just to see the results of that as well. So back into Blender, and I'll just bring down my UV image editor slightly, zoom out just a touch, and I'll bring my textures into here. So I've downloaded all 4 of those textures, and I can actually select them from here and drag them into my shader editor like this. I can only do this one at a time though, so I have to drag them all in separately, and I'll minimize that window, and I can now swap our Musgrave texture for our plank textures. So I'll delete the Musgrave texture, bring our first plank texture in. So I'm just speeding up the footage of me organizing the textures slightly. I've just expanded them so you can see the names and put them on top of each other. So I've maximized the shader editor so you can see the different texture names. And I'm going to start with this one here, which looks like this, which ends in 4_4_M. So I'll hook that up to the color, and I can hook this up to each one of these, like so. And I'll just speed that footage up slightly. And then I can easily just plug this end color node into the base color for each one I want to try. I'll press Control Spacebar to come out of full screen mode, and you can see my barrel texture on here. Let's find the texture in here, which is this one just here, ending in 4_M, and I need to shift around my UVs slightly. So take a moment to catch up with me and bring in your textures and hook up the texture that I mentioned earlier. Okay, let's zoom in just a touch to my UV editor. And a challenge to you now is to set up your UVs so that the barrel texture sits nicely onto our cylinder so it looks a little bit like a barrel. Pause the video and have a go at that. So the main thing I need to change is my big middle section here. So with the island selected, I'll select that island, scale in the X, make it nice and big, and G then X, and move it across so it's covering those end planks. I'll just scale it in the X so it's slightly thinner like this, and we've got a sort of barrel looking thing there. And it works reasonably well. We can see the seam here and it's not too bad. So that's quite a successful texture, that one. Let's just have a look at the top. They're looking quite nice, even though they're not particularly round. Let's select those islands, and I can select them at the same time by holding down Shift and scale in the X, and I can round them out like this, and it stops that stretching. I'll undo that so you can see the slight stretching there, and redo it with Control Shift Z, and you can see it's not stretching as much. So making these into circles by scaling them in the X works nicely. Now lastly, you may want to edit your barrel slightly. So if I press Control R over the top of my barrel to do a loop cut around the middle, and maybe create 2 loops like this, and right click. Notice if I move the loops up and down, they don't distort the texture, and I'll talk about that in the next lecture. But I'll right click so they stay in the center, and I'll scale them outwards, so S to scale and Shift Z so they don't scale up or down. So we've got a more rounded out barrel like this. It's a little bit square, so with those 2 selected, I can press Control B to bevel and make it a little bit smoother like this. So it's got more of a curve, and notice it's creating the UVs according to where I'm adding those loop cuts. So that's 2 loop cuts around the middle, and I've beveled them so that they create this curve. I find it easier to do 2 loop cuts and then bevel rather than starting with 4 loop cuts that I would have to scale at different sizes. So in the next lecture, we'll be looking at the other textures and how they fit onto our barrel and the problems you might come across with those. But for now, I want you to finish off your barrel doing the 2 loop cuts like I have here and creating the bevel. And then, of course, make sure you save your work ready for next time. In this lecture, we'll be taking our knowledge of UVs further by creating a few barrels and adding different material textures to each one. So here's where we got up to last time with our barrel, and I'm still in edit mode with the barrel selected. I'm just going to open up my shader editor and zoom out a touch. So we've got our 4 textures ready here. And of course, we can find and look at those textures within here as well with the different names. And in order to show you a few more things about UV unwrapping, I'm going to duplicate the barrel 3 times. So I've got 4 different barrels to add my textures to. So into object mode, select barrel. And in fact, I'll hide the building for the moment so it's not distracting. Select the barrel, Shift D to duplicate in the X axis, and I'll press Shift R to repeat that action twice. So we've got 4 barrels ready here. Now it is worth noting at this point that you can see the textures are all exactly the same. Yet it is very common to use one single texture for an object like this and repeat it over and over. Some of the tricks that environmental artists use is just selecting them, rotating them around the Z-axis slightly, and suddenly it looks like a slightly different barrel. So it's worth bearing that in mind. Also, if I undo that, ideally with your textures you try and keep away from distinguishing marks. So this white line that's going around here is repeated over each barrel, and it's quite a distinguishing mark which makes us realize immediately that it's a repeated texture. So that's just something to be aware of. So just pause the video for a moment, catch up with me and duplicate your barrel so that you have one for each texture that you've downloaded. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so with the second barrel selected, I'm going to link up my bottom texture, and that is ending in 4_1_M. So I'll link that up to the base color. And of course, all my barrels change because they're all sharing the same texture. So I'll undo that. What I need to do is to create a new texture based on this one for this new barrel. Well, hopefully you remember that's this button up here, add new material. But if I use this one, it creates a new texture, material 002, which I'll rename barrel 2. But now when I change it to the texture shown here, it only changes that one barrel. I'll just click on the original barrel and change the name there as well. So barrel 1, and reselect barrel 2 with the barrel 2 texture. I could of course rename my objects in the outliner as well, but there's no real need for that as we haven't got many items in our scene. So the reason I wanted to show you this texture, which if we look down at the bottom is ending in 4_1_M. So let's find that texture within here, 4_1_M. And let's just bring that texture out so we can see it nice and easily. Now, as I mentioned, it's darker here on the metal parts than it is up the top here. So if I zoom in with the period key and move around until I find my seam, it's very obvious where it is. That's because the metal gets darker here and lighter here. So the barrel looks relatively good from somewhere like here where it's got nice dark metal brackets there. But as soon as I come around where the seam is, it gets very light. It's also worth saying at this point that these seams are often unavoidable. So what often happens is we try and hide those against the wall or foliage or something like that. So hopefully that highlights the point about using textures that are relatively consistent. So if I go back to my first one and choose that texture within here, so that's ending in _4_M, you can see that that's relatively consistent throughout. And if I move around my barrel, it's actually a little bit harder to find the seam on this one, which makes it a good texture for texturing. Okay, so let's go to my third one. And for this one, you can follow along. I'll make my shader editor a bit bigger, zoom out a touch, and I'm going to hook the second one up, which is _2_M. I'm going to create a new material called barrel 3, and I'm going to hook up my second material ending in 2_M up to the base color, and I'll open that texture up in the UV editor. So 2_M there, and that's just the planks. Now this is nice and consistent in color, but as a barrel it's not working particularly well. The planks seem very wide. If I go into edit mode and select all to look at the UVs, we can see that my big flat island here, if I select that with all the middle faces going around, is covering the whole texture. We know it's the right way around because my slats are going up and down, so that's good. But what I can do here is scale in the Y and go outside the bounds of the texture to make those slats look a bit thinner. And now it's ending up looking a little bit more like a barrel. I'll zoom out a bit to show you the results of that. So when your UVs go outside the bounds of this texture, it just repeats itself. And that's common in most programs, including game engines. And if I deselect all with Alt-A, the texture is nice and consistent in terms of the tone, so the light bits and dark bits, so you don't really notice the repetition. So if we come around to our seam, it's actually difficult to see that it's repeating. You can in fact get what are called seamless textures, so that when you repeat them like this, you don't see the edge overlap. This is close to a seamless texture, so when we repeat it like this, we don't really see where the overlap is. And you can see there's a tiny little notch there, and it's not coming through on this side, so we know it's not actually seamless, although it's very close to. So somewhere along the line, we should actually see that line. But to be honest, I can't notice it, so it's a very close to seamless texture. Okay, so I'll just select all again, just so you can see my UVs. And I want you to pause the video here, catch up with me, create a new material for this barrel, and attach that plank texture, or a similar texture, and just expand those UVs, in my case in the Y-axis, so that they repeat around your barrel. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so if I just zoom out a bit and go back to object mode, it doesn't quite work as well as the first one as a barrel because it hasn't got those brackets at the top and the bottom, but it does give a reasonably convincing result. Now for the fourth barrel, if I just zoom in on that and create a new material, so this is barrel 4, and I'll zoom out I want you to use the texture ending in 19_M. So that's this one at the bottom here. And I want you to try and texture your barrel so it looks fairly convincing using this texture. So you'll have to move around the UVs slightly. You may have to repeat them by scaling it in one of the two axes, depending on how you've unwrapped it, and try and come up with something that looks relatively good. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so hopefully you've gone okay with that. So I'll just hook up this top material and we can see that it doesn't look quite right yet. So I'll go into edit mode, select all, and have a look at the islands. Firstly, I'll select this big island here, and the slats look like they're going the right way, but they do look a bit stretched. So if I press S then Y, that makes this bigger, the slats go round a bit further, and let's have a look what that looks like. It's looking a bit better. Perhaps we'll try it a bit further, so scale in the Y again. And around there, it looks fairly convincing, as if these wooden brackets are holding it together. The top looks a little bit odd though, so maybe we could select one of those faces. I'll go to face mode for that, select the face, and select it in here, and just scale it in the X so it's not so stretched. Maybe move it into a different position, somewhere around here, scale it up a touch, so it kind of repeats across my shape, and perhaps that's working a little bit better. It's still not as convincing as the first, but it is a little bit better than the second, because it has these wooden slats in it, in my opinion anyway. So hopefully you've gotten okay with that task, and you realized about scaling up the UVs. If I go into edit mode again, select all, the big island, the one going around the middle, I needed to rescale so that the slats fitted the model more closely. And if I go into object mode, this type of wooden board texture seems to just about work as a barrel, and goes some way to show that you don't have to use a specific barrel texture for a barrel, which goes for any object. So sometimes if you want a specific material, it's not always the case that you can find it, or the textures you find aren't quite suitable because they change in tone like we were talking about earlier, or they don't repeat very well. So you might have to use a different type of texture for an object to get a close approximation to it. That comes with more experience, and you'll find that out in your 3D artist journey. Now, one last thing that I do want to show you. Let's go back to our original barrel because it's probably a little bit easier to see. I'll zoom in on that, go to edit mode and select all, and I'll just check which texture that is. So it's _M_4, so let's find that in here. And I'll just zoom in on that slightly so we can clearly see it. Now, if I select an edge loop, so into edge mode, Alt left click on an edge loop and press G to grab and move it upwards, you can see that it stretches my texture. I'll undo those changes though. However, if I press G twice, or GG as I like to say, for edge slide, you can see that I can slide it along my edges of my shape, and it actually moves the UVs as well as the edge on the object. So the edge slide can be a very useful tool for adjusting your objects without drastically changing the UVs. You might want to pause the video here and just have an experiment with that. So select an edge loop and use the edge slide command, so GG, to see how it actually moves with the UVs as well as the shape's topology. So lastly, if I bring back my building, which is this cube here, I'll go into object mode, zoom out and select that building and press the period key to zoom in on that. If I go into edit mode for this, and let's say choose this edge here and press GG, I can edge slide this edge to change the shape of my building without changing the shape of the UVs. Now, if I press C, which is for clamp, because currently it's clamped to the original size of the shape, and you can see those commands at the top of my window. So there's E for even, Alt or C for clamp. Now I can go upwards and use the rest of the texture and make my building taller. So I can then come to this side, press GG and then C for clamp to turn the clamping off, and it will use the rest of my texture up there as well. And now I've got a taller building. I'll just select all and go across to my building texture just there, and you can see how it's stretched those buildings. An interesting face is this one because it's actually repeating, which I believe is this one round the back here, and you can see how the texture's repeated, starting on the bottom again and going upwards halfway into this window here. So the edge slide tool is very useful for moving your UVs around as well as your topology or the shape of the object. So lastly, pause the video here and have a go at changing the shape of your building using the edge slide command. So choosing an edge, double tapping G, and remember to turn off clamp with C so it goes beyond the original border or edges of the shape. Once you've done that, make sure you've saved your work, ready for next time. In this next section of lectures, we'll be taking our knowledge of UV unwrapping to the next level by unwrapping a complex object, so a Spitfire aeroplane. In this particular lecture, we'll be importing the reference images so we can make the model of our Spitfire. Now I've started a new scene so it's nice and simple and there's no distractions, but you could easily put this into the scene with our barrels and our building, and you could then change the shape of the building to be some sort of airport hangar or radio tower or something similar to that, and build a whole airport. And I'll be showing you how you can take objects from one scene to another, so we can easily append, as it's known, or import the plane we make into our other scene. So let's import our images. In the resources that come with this lecture, you'll see that you've got a plane front, a plane side and a plane top images, which we can bring into Blender. So I'll click the front one and just bring that in, and bring the side one in, and bring the top one in as well. I'll minimize that, and I'll just select all these three, Alt-G to remove any movement, and Alt-R to remove any rotation. I'll click on the cube and press H to hide for the moment, and select our first one here, which looks like the front. I'll rotate by the X 90 degrees. Oh, actually I selected the side view, but that's fine. I can rotate by the X 90 degrees for that, and RZ 90, so that's side view. I'm going to label this as well, that will help us. I'll select the next one, which looks like top view, and that's the correct rotation. So I'll double click on that and also rename that top. And the last one there, this looks like front view, RX90, and just check that. And that looks correct, so I'll double click on that and type in front. Also, I'll select all three of these and move them to a new collection. So M, new collection, plane, ref. Now I can easily hide them in the viewport and make them visible when I need to. Okay, now they need a little bit of lining up. So first of all, I'll move the side and the front view away from the middle. So G, then X for the side view. I'll move that this way, and the front view here, G, then Y, and move it backwards. And the top view, G, then Z to move it downwards. That way, when I bring my cube back, by clicking on the eye, I can model in front of each of these views, side, front, and top. So pause the video and catch up with me, placing your reference images into the scene so that they've got the right rotation and that they're in a location where you can model in front of them. Okay, so what I need to do now is line them up. So we'll start with one view. So in this case, I'll take the top view and I'll just zoom in slightly, make sure that top view is selected. I'll just go to the object data properties and turn the opacity on and bring that down to something like 0.5 in this case. Seems to work well. Now we can see instantly that it doesn't quite line up with the middle. So I can press G then X and move that across, hold down Shift to move in smaller increments and move it into the middle there, and left click. So how do I get the front of the plane here in top view to line up with the front of the plane in side view there? Well, I'll go back to top view and I'm going to use my starting cube, the default cube as we call it, as a reference. And I can move my cube, so G then Y, to the front of the plane. So it's bang on the front of the plane just there. Now when I go to side view, I can select my side image and G then Y, holding down Shift to move that to exactly the front there. But how do I know the back end is lining up? Well, let's take our cube. I'll go to top view again, and this time I'll go into edit mode and into wireframe, select the back of the cube, G then Y, and move that so it's touching the back there. So this cube is exactly the right length. So back into object mode, back into side view, and we can see that my side view is nowhere near the right size. If I scale this now, it will scale the front as well. And we can do that, and we can press G to grab and move it into position, scale it a bit again. But instead, if I move the 3D cursor to here, and then change my transform pivot point to the 3D cursor, and press S to scale, it will scale from the front there, and I can move that precisely to the back. So I should have the top and side view lining up nicely now. So pause the video and have a go at that. So you've got your top view and side view lined up with each other. Lastly then is the rear view. So I'll go to top view again, select my cube. Oh, I'm going by the 3D cursor here, so I'll turn it back to medium point and scale by the X and make sure it's the width of my wings. That way when I go to front view, making sure that my front image is selected, I can scale that down so the wings touch the edge of the box like this. Lastly then, we need to make sure that the side view and the front view are in line. So let's say the bottom of the plane. So I'll go to side view, select my cube, which seems to be a little bit awkward at the moment. And it's actually just a highlight problem. It wasn't highlighting correctly, probably because I'm in X-ray mode. Let's try wireframe instead. That will make it a bit easier. And again, go to side view, and I'll scale my cube so it's the right height for the plane. So somewhere around here, G then Z to move it upwards. I'll just zoom in so we can see it nice and easily. So that's hitting the bottom of the plane there. And I'll go into edit mode and choose the top of the cube, G then Z to move that upwards. So it's hitting the top of the rudder there and the bottom of the plane. Back into object mode, back to front view this time. Select my front view and G then Z to move it upwards. And about there looks good. And I'll grab it in the X-axis to make sure it's nicely aligned there, and I'll scale it up as well because I'm not quite touching the edge with my wings. Lastly, I'll turn off perspective for each of the views so that they don't appear in perspective mode. Now when I go to front view, side view and top view, I'll just see those, but when I go into 3D view, I'm not distracted by them. The very last thing for me to do, I think side view, I might turn the opacity on for that as well, so it's not too distracting. So your challenge then is to make sure all your reference images are aligned and ready for our plane model. Once you've done that, make sure you've saved your work, ready for next time. In this lecture, we'll start building the body of our plane following our reference images. I'll also be introducing the Auto Mirror tool. So here's where we got up to last time, and I'm still in wireframe mode, and it's probably best to go to solid mode, but also have X-ray mode. Then when I go to something like side view, with 3, zoom in, there's my cube in front of my reference image, and I can easily see the reference image because of X-ray view. And with the cube selected, I can resize it with S to scale and bring it into position, and I'll start with this section here. So scale in the Y, bring that into position somewhere around here. So it's taking up this section. The reference image should be fairly helpful because you can see the topology of the faces and how many loop cuts and things like that we have. You can see that there's an edge coming down here. It's a little distracting with the wing, and we'll come to that later, but when modeling, try and focus on the base shapes first and build up slowly. Now I'm going to switch to front view and obviously scale in the X to make sure my shape matches the front profile. Now I could have used the cylinder, and you can see it's got 1, 2, 3, 4 faces going around one side, but it's actually easier to start off with a cube and then divide it later on because it's easier to edit. And once I've got that base shape, then I can start adding detail. So when building complex models, you get the base shape first and you build up the detail afterwards. So that's what it looks like at the moment, fairly basic. And I want you to pause the video here, catch up with me, resize your cube so it's a similar position to mine, both side view and front view. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so we can see some symmetry from one side to the other, so it would make sense to make this a mirrored object. Now we can go into edit mode, cut the shape in half, delete half the shape and add our mirror, but I'm going to show you a really useful add-on. If I go up to Edit, Preferences, under Add-ons, type in Mirror, and there's the Auto Mirror tool. Make sure that's ticked and close down your preferences. Now when I press N on my keyboard and go to the Edit tab, you'll see Auto Mirror is there. I've got another add-on enabled called Ball Tools. Ball Tools is not necessary for this course. Now with my object selected, I can mirror in the X, Y or Z, but always remember before pressing the Auto Mirror button, it will mirror around our object origin. So if I zoom in, you can see our object origin is in the center along the X-axis, so that's fine, not along the Z-axis. So if I were to mirror in the Z-axis, that may cause us slight problems. We can easily recenter it by right-clicking, Set Origin, and then Origin to Geometry. That will put it right into the center of the object. So now I can press Auto Mirror, and it looks like nothing's happened, but if I go to the mirror tools here, you can see I have a mirror modifier enabled. It's in the X-axis, clipping's been turned on, and if I go into edit mode, you can see I've got one side that I can edit. So it's a nice quick way of setting up your mirrors. So pause the video here and enable the Auto Mirror add-on. Then make sure your object origin is in the center of your object, and use the Auto Mirror under the Edit menu in the X-axis to create your mirror. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so now I'm going to go around to side view and just extrude my shape outwards. Now make sure you don't click once here and shift click here and then extrude, because that way I'm just extruding this edge. I haven't selected the vertices behind those other vertices. So I'll undo that and I'll go back to side view. You must box select like this So you've got all 4 selected, and then E to extrude and pull them outwards. And I might want to scale these down very slightly. Do remember when you're scaling, you're also scaling in the x-axis this direction as well. So once again, back to side view, E to extrude and scale that down, E to extrude and scale that down. Let's just double check that, and that's looking fine. Like I say, we can modify the shape a bit more later on by adding a loop cut down the middle and then moving this top outside edge inwards a bit, and again this one inwards a bit, and we'll end up with a more rounded shape. So back to side view, select the back with box select, E to extrude to pull that backwards and scale it down. So I'm following this shape, and I can then select these ones here and E to extrude to pull them upwards. I'll tap Z to take away the Z axis so it doesn't go at an angle, and I can move it up to there, and then I can grab this one here and move that up into position as well. Then I can select all 3 at the back, E to extrude outwards, scale down, and it gets a bit messy and complicated at the back here. What I'm going to do for now is just E to extrude all the way back to the edge of the shape here and scale it right down to something like this. Then I can press Ctrl R to do a loop cut down the middle, ready for extruding out that back tail fin. So I've followed my reference image, and I've got the base shape of the middle section of the plane. Your challenge then is to do exactly the same. Try and follow the topology as best as possible, then you'll end up with something that's very similar to mine. Once you've done that, make sure you've saved your work, ready for next time. In this lecture, we'll be building the tail fin and the different wings. Okay, so here's where we got up to last time. And I don't really need this panel on the side here anymore, so I'll press N to get rid of that. And we'll start working on rounding out the shape of our plane. So first of all, I can do a loop cut down the middle, so Ctrl R, and then a loop cut down the middle there, double left click, so it's right in the center. And at this point, I can then come around to the bottom here, Alt left click to select that edge loop going along the bottom, GG to edge slide, come into the middle, and GG to edge slide, so it goes back up. So that's how we can create those rounded shapes. So I can select this one here, GG to edge slide down, and GG to edge slide towards the middle. Now it does look a little bit strange because we've got this top bit here that looks a little bit out, but I can GG to edge slide that in towards the middle, and GG to edge slide it down like this. So we've got a nice rounded out plane like so. So pause the video here and add that edge loop around the middle. Then select your edge loops with Alt left click and use the GG command or the edge slide command to create some roundness to your shape. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so now we need to sort out the back slightly because it should go into a flat position at the back here, so become less rounded like this all the way towards the back. And also you might notice that this line along here sticks out a little bit more than this line. That's okay, we can modify those as we go along. First of all, let's select these back verts here, and if I press S, X and 0, that will scale them in the x-axis to 0 and therefore line them up. I can then press G then X to move them in like this. Same with these ones, S, X, 0, enter, G then X to move them inwards. We could go to top view at this point to line those up, and that's about right. I'll select the next one as along, because if I go to side view, that's where our fin starts from. So back to top view, and I'll press S, then X, just to scale them in slightly, but not all the way to 0. So somewhere around here, then G, then X to move those in. So it's starting to move out to some sort of roundness there. These ones, I can then scale in the X very slightly, and again G, then X, and move those inwards. So it slowly comes out to this position here. I'll just G, then X to move that in a slight bit there. So that's that one that was sticking out there, and you can see we've got a gradual slope inwards, which is looking reasonably good. It sticks out a little bit too much with these two. Hopefully you can see that. So I can press G then X to move those inwards, and again have a good look around, make sure they're roughly in line, and that's working nicely by the looks of things. I might bring this one and this one in slightly as well, G then X. It may not follow quite my reference, but I think it will work a bit better. Okay, I'll take a good look around, make sure that's all okay. So pause the video here and flatten out the back of your plane's body so we're ready for the tail fin. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so now I'm going to go into face mode and select these back two faces. If I go into side view, you can see that's where the tail fin is going to extend from. Now if I press E to extrude now and pull that up, If I come back round to perspective view, you can see that they're sticking out slightly. So I'll undo that and just show you again, E to extrude, and notice that's extruding along that blue line there, which is the normals of that face. So again, I'll undo that. So when I press E to extrude, if I press Z once, I can move it freely, but if I press Z again, so in essence Z twice, that will actually go upwards along the Z axis. So I'll go to somewhere like here, go to side view and just line that up. So scale in the Y, G to grab, R to rotate, and scale it out a little bit in the Y so it's roughly in the right place. So somewhere around there. And now if I come around to the side and press S, Z, 0, I've flattened it out, which should help us for the next extrusion. So if I go to side view again, E to extrude upwards, scale in the Y to bring that in, just somewhere around here. I'm not quite following the reference, which has this edge loop a little bit lower, but that should be fine. If I go around to the side here, you can see that it's flattened out. Although this edge just at the end here is a little bit wide, so I'll go to edge mode there, GG to edge slide to bring that in slightly, and that looks like it's a little bit more in line. So back to face mode, select those two top faces, side view, E to extrude to bring that upwards, S to scale in the Y, and move that in position, and finish off the other extrusions as well. One there, E to extrude, and scale that one down as well. Now it looks like there's an extra line there, but there's not, and I'll show you why in just a moment. But for now, I want you to extrude that tail so it goes upwards. So remember to tap Z twice, and you might want to scale in the Z0 to flatten them out as well. So pause the video and catch up with me. Okay, let's go to side view, and I might just want to tidy up a touch. So let's zoom in a bit. One to go to vertex mode, and I'll just bring this one out slightly. This one looks a little bit out of place. And the bottom here, I can grab those and pull them in. These ones too. I'll try and make it a little bit more in line actually than the reference. This one can come in. These can come in slightly, and this one can come up slightly by the looks of things, just somewhere around here. I'm trying to follow my reference a little bit more now because I need to extrude from this area for the tail wing, so probably somewhere around here I think. And it looks like there's a little bit of a mess here, so GG to edge slide and just slide that down so it's roughly in line. Back to side view. This one can go up slightly and this one across slightly, and I think that looks quite good. Now to round this out, I can select from the top here down to the bottom here, so that's control left clicking and GG to edge slide to bring those in, and it creates some roundness. I'm also going to scale in the Z to create some roundness like that as well, just a tiny bit, and then from this one to this one, GG, and let's tidy the top up just a touch, so GG to slide those down a touch. Now let's go to side view and maybe just create a bit more roundness around here and a little bit more curve. So let's go back into object mode and see how I'm looking. That's not looking too bad. Into edit mode, you can see the topology. That seems to be working well. Okay, so pause the video here and round out the back area of your plane. Okay, let's go back to side view. Incidentally, the topology line that you can see on the reference here is just the rounding out that I was doing just a moment ago. And that's why it may look like there's an extra line in the reference. So now into face mode with 3 and select these two faces here. I can now press I to inset to bring those in slightly and scale in the Y to bring them into the right size for the tail wing. Let's go to top view for this, E to extrude outwards. To around here, let's just check that that's gone out smoothly. Yes, it has. They were nice and flat. There was no angle, so they didn't go up or across. I can always check with front view if I want to, and that looks good. So back to top view, scale in the Y, and maybe just adjust these slightly. So I'll bring this back slightly here. That looks pretty good. So select all, E to extrude, scale in the Y, down to somewhere like here, G to grab, and maybe just bring these out slightly to there. Let's see how that's looking. That seems to be working well. We could select these end ones here, maybe go to proportional edit and scale in the Z. I'll just bring my circle of influence down and scale those down so it becomes a bit thinner towards the edge. I think that would be a bit more accurate than my reference, in fact. Okay, that's looking nice and working well. So pause the video here and catch up with me. First, we need to do the inset of those two faces, and then we can extrude out for our tail wing. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, let's go to side view again and just have a look at where our wing is coming from. So let's zoom in a bit on this. Now we can see there's an extra loop cut that I missed there, and we're using this loop cut for the back of the wing, so I can press Ctrl R to do a loop cut here and move that along. And if I go to front view, we're coming out from that face there, back to side view, so I believe it's, if I go to face mode with 3, these two faces here. Let's just have a quick look around the plane, make sure I'm right there. That looks about right. Let's just go to side view, look at our reference. That seems to be roughly in line, although it can be a little bit confusing around this plane, around the wing, but we can probably sort that out once we've got the base shape, remember. Let's go to top view for this with 7 and extrude outwards, so E to extrude to somewhere like here, scale in the Y. Oh, and remember I've got proportional edit on, so I'll turn that off. Scale in the Y, G to move that into position, somewhere around there, and let's go to edge mode and bring those ones into here. But before extruding, let's just check what's happening with the direction. Now it's slightly off, so we need to go to front view. And first of all, I can scale these in the X0, so they flatten out, and move them up slightly to here. Scale in the Z, and it looks like my whole shape here can come down slightly, so G then Z, with all those selected, they can come down slightly like this, which means I can move these into position. Let's just see what's happened there. That seems to have worked, and that's why there's a slight dip in the shape here, but that seems to work quite well, I think. So to create that dip, I was able to select all these, and I can move them up and downwards like that, as you can see. And I line them up with the front view there. So pause the video here and do that first extrusion and make sure it lines up nicely with the reference. And once you've done that, I want to challenge you to complete the rest of the wing from here. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so I'll select those end faces there, back to top view, E to extrude outwards to somewhere around here. And let's just go into perspective mode and see how we're getting on. Back to front view, scale that down a bit, G to grab into position, back to top view, and I could extrude the wing out and then edit, or I could edit now. Probably easier just to extrude the wing out and then move it into position. So just about there, I'll move across slightly, 1 to go to vertex mode. You could choose edge mode as well. Move that into position there, move that into position there. This one down to here, and this one up to here. Let's just have a look how we're looking. That seems to be looking great. To front view, and these need to scale down, so scale in the Z, move them upwards, a little bit of rotation perhaps, and this one, they look like they move backwards slightly. Don't think that makes too much difference though. So how are we looking? And it looks like that's working really nicely. So into object mode, turn off X-ray just so we can see our plane, and the body of the plane's looking really good there. Now the very last thing that I think would be helpful, if I zoom in a bit and go into edit mode, is to select the edge loop here and the edge loop just underneath it and scale in the Z. I think a sort of bit more roundness to the wing, maybe at the back here as well. So these two, scale in the Z. And I think that works a little bit better anyway. This one at the front here, GG to edge slide and move that backwards. And this edge along here, GG to bring that forward slightly. Looks a tiny bit more like a wing then. These are minor adjustments which you don't really have to follow along with, but I think it makes a bit of a difference. So hopefully you got an okay making the wing. Take a moment to make any adjustments you think are necessary. Now you've seen the way I've done it. Once you've done that, make sure you've saved your work, ready for next time. In this lecture, we're going to complete the model of our plane, modeling the propellers at the front and the cockpit. So here's where we got up to last time. And in order to make the front propeller, I'm going to select the plane, go into edit mode, come around to the front here, go to vertex mode with 1, select that front vertex and press Shift S. So this is my cursor menu, and I can select cursor to selected. That brings my 3D cursor right on top of that vertex there. So now I can go back into object mode, Shift A to add, mesh, and then cylinder. Not a cone, and in fact I very rarely use a cone. A cylinder is always a little bit better because of the topology. So cylinder it is. Across to the add cylinder options, and I'll change the verts to 8, so it's nice and low poly. Let's zoom in on that a bit. RX90, scale it down, and let's go to top view so I can see the propeller nice and easily. Zoom in a touch, and G then Y, move it so it's slightly overlapping my plane there. Just quickly see how that's looking. The plane's not completely circular, so I'll just scale it down a touch more so it doesn't overlap in a strange way. Somewhere around there looks good. Let's go to side view, and now my plane is very slightly out, so I'll just select on the plane. Let's go to wireframe and just scale this end up slightly. Then with my cylinder, scale that up slightly. And that's about right, maybe just down a touch. So G then Z, there we go, that looks about right. Back to side view and into edit mode. Let's select these end edges here. Remember, I'm in X-ray mode, so I can select the ones in the background as well. And I'll scale those down and G then Y to move them forwards. There's a bit of a curve to this, so Control R to do a couple of loop cuts, I think. So using the wheel of my mouse to create two and scale those up, but Shift Y so they don't expand in the Y axis. Somewhere about there looks good. Into object mode, out of wireframe, let's just check that, and that looks nice. So pause the video and catch up with me creating that front nose using a cylinder in the same way as I've done here. So what about the propeller? Well, let's go to front view for that. And again into X-ray mode so I can see one of my propellers on my reference image. And for the propeller, I'm going to use a plane. So Shift A to add, mesh, and then plane, RX90 to rotate it around the X-axis 90 degrees, scale it down, and just move it to this first part just here. So scale it down just a touch more. I'll zoom in on that and into edit mode, and let's just copy the shape of the propeller. So G then Z to move that down. Select these two, E to extrude upwards and scale out. E to extrude again and scale in, and E to extrude again up to the top here and scale it right down. So we've got a really basic propeller shape like this. So pause the video here and catch up with me and create your propeller out of a plane. Now to add thickness to this, there's a nice modifier. So across the modifiers, with the spanner or wrench icon there, add modifier, and it's under generate, solidify. So I'll just zoom in on this for a moment so you can see the results. And let's go into object mode and G then Y to move it forward to stop that overlap that was happening there. Now the thickness is the main parameter that we need to change. And if I make that thicker and thinner, you can see that happening there. This is probably easier to see without X-ray mode on. So I'll just turn that off so you can see the thickness that's happening just there. Most of the other parameters you don't really need to worry about. The offset is kind of the direction in which it goes. So if I change this to 1, the thickness now comes out of the front sort of thing, and to 0, it comes out of the back like this. So if I set this to 0, it will come out both sides. Now one thing to note, this thickness of 0.35 meters suggests that the thickness should be 30 centimeters. If I press N and go to item, we can see that the object dimensions, it's a little bit confusing because remember I've rotated it 90 degrees, but we can see the width and the height there being 14 centimeters and 50 centimeters roughly. So the thickness certainly isn't 35, otherwise it would be out here somewhere. Well, that's because it's thinking about my scale. So the scale is way down below 1, therefore this is 35 centimeters, and then this scale is applied to it. So if I press Ctrl A, and apply my scale, you can see now that looks more like 35 centimeters. So just a quick reminder there about the idea of applying your scale so that these measurements are therefore correct. So I'll come across to the thickness and bring that right down to somewhere about 0.02, which makes a bit more sense. Okay, so pause the video here and add your solidify modifier to your plane to give it some thickness. Now the great thing about this modifier is that if I go into edit mode again, and let's turn on X-ray mode so I can easily see it, anything I do to this, any edits I make, let's say I want to smooth this out a bit, so I'll go into edge mode, select these two edges and Ctrl B to bevel, so it's nice and smooth and rounded. You can see that it's still got the solidify modifier on and it's still adding that thickness, but it was nice and simple for me to make those changes. How about getting that kind of twist that propellers have? Well, if I select, let's say the top 3 edges, go to proportional edit and R then Z, we can easily add a little bit of twist to our propeller. It's probably a little bit too much, so R then Z, let's go back a little bit just about there. So we created an interesting looking propeller, nice and easily, just using this simple plane which we can see here. So pause the video here and add a bit of twist to your propeller. Okay, lastly, I need to repeat this a couple of times. I'll just move it into position, so into object mode, G then Y to move that forward slightly. Let's line it up with side view, so just a bit further forward, just around there. That looks great. Okay, now to front view, and my 3D cursor is in the middle of that front nose there. So I can use that as my transform pivot point. And when I rotate, I should be able to rotate around it 120 degrees, and they should be positioned perfectly. For this, I'm going to press Alt-D to create a linked duplicate, so any changes I make will update on all of them. Then R120, and that seems to have worked, so press Enter, and I can press Shift-R to repeat last, and that's round across to the other one. And remember, if I make any changes to one of these, so let's say scale this up, it's scaling them all up. It's a bit weird because I've got proportional edit on and it's going by the 3D cursor. I'll undo that, I'll turn proportional edit off so that doesn't confuse, and I'll turn the transform pivot point back to the medium point. And back into object mode, and let's see how we're getting on. Turn X-ray off, and our plane's looking pretty good. So pause the video here and duplicate your single propeller so that you've then got 3. Okay, so the last thing for me to add is the cockpit. That's nice and simple. It's a completely separate object that overlaps the plane. So a challenge to you is to have a go at modeling that yourself. Don't panic if you don't feel comfortable, just make sure you've saved your work, have a go, see how you get on, and if it goes wrong, just follow along with me in a moment. So pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so let's go to side view, move my 3D cursor into position, Shift-A to add mesh and then cube. Scale that right down to somewhere around about here. Let's go into X-ray view now and zoom in. Now it's a symmetrical object, so we could add a mirror to this. So let's come around to the front here, go to the edit options, and there's auto mirror there in the X-axis. Incidentally, positive is the default, so the positive X is the one here. So when I press auto mirror and go into edit mode, it's this side that we can edit. So it deletes the other side, and that's the mirror. So I'll press N to get rid of that panel. And remember, the auto mirror has clipping enabled automatically, and also it mirrors around your object origin. Okay, so back to side view, into edit mode, and let's just line this up. That one there, that one roughly there. These I can press E to extrude and G to grab to move it down. And these ones, it looks like I can just bring that out like this. I'll just sort the bottom out as well so it's level, not that it makes a huge amount of difference because it's overlapping. So there's the rough shape, but it's not quite overlapping completely. So I'm just going to go off the references slightly and just G then Z to move that down to make sure it is fully overlapping my plane. The top verts here, I can select those and GG to edge slide across there and GG to edge slide down. I'm just going to GG and slide it down a bit more because of that overlap slightly there. And this edge here, GG to edge slide across, and that's a nice simple cockpit that we've got there. Let's come out of X-ray mode so you can see the results of that. It's nice and simple and seems to work quite well. Okay, so hopefully you got an okay with that and you've now completed your plane. As always, do make sure you've saved your work ready for next time.